This podcast covers a murder that occurred in 1983. It is a true story, and while I have relied heavily on police reports and public documents, the opinions of the host and interviewees are simply that, opinions, not facts. The credibility of the witnesses and what they say is to be determined by the listener. Everyone is presumed innocent until proven otherwise in a court of law. I can only tell you, based on the Michigan State Police report, who they went at pretty hard in the early days and years of the investigation. I have no idea if any of these folks are still on the list, although Detective Pratt himself told me when I interviewed him that he rules out no one until there is an arrest. The initial fingerprint list that they put together was comprised of the following people. Christopher Cassavetes, that would be Sr. He was a customer who lived in the area. I spoke to his son, Christopher Cassavetes Jr., and he told me that his father was in to make a purchase that day. His name never came up again in the report. All of the employees were printed, including Flossie, both Dave and Bonnie Ingalls, John Ingalls, the store manager, Donna Evans, another employee, Angie Tilley, the clerk who found Janette, and a man named David Sandlin, who was a part-time employee. According to his wife, he only worked there on truck delivery days. Early on, he was compelled to turn over some clothing, so it appears he may have gotten something on them that looked like blood. His name also never comes up again in the report. Also on that initial fingerprint list were Reed City Officer Theodore Platts, Ralph Fisher, Janette's father, and a man named George Wilson, who I learned was an indigent man that the locals called Injun George. George Wilson, a.k.a. Injun George, was interviewed by Detective Pratt, and his name came up a great deal when I spoke with Reed City residents regarding this case. I found that for the most part, people generally pointed a finger in his direction because he was a local eccentric who collected bottles and cans and was generally odd enough to make people uncomfortable. As far as employees go, anyone who was at work that day was literally at the crime scene. If their alibi is that they were at work when the murder occurred, they would remain on the persons of interest list, unless there was some other way to verify that they had not gone down, killed Janette, and then somehow cleaned up and remained in the store, acting as if nothing had happened until someone found her body. I asked a few people in and around law enforcement at the time if any of the employees were looked at as hard as the suspects that I will discuss in a minute, and no one could recall that they had been. Detective Southworth told me that he didn't recall any of the employees being looked at hard as far as being suspects. That doesn't mean it wasn't done. Detective Pratt could have been doing a whole lot of things behind the scenes that didn't end up in his official report. Sometimes with small towns, and when you have a lot of law enforcement entities with their hands in the pot, there are certain things you have to do quietly so that word does not get around. There was a lot of talk and loose lips in the beginning of this investigation, as I learned when multiple people told me that they had heard specifics about injuries from Officer Finkbeiner, specifics that would only have come from someone who had seen Janette's body. The employees were all questioned by Detective Pratt on multiple occasions. They called them back quite a few times, certainly as witnesses because they would have been there all day, and they were all re-questioned by Detectives Albright and Vincent on the second go-around. In fact, after Detectives Albright and Vincent had gone through re-questioning all of the witnesses and persons of interest that had been initially developed, they were ordered to go back to all of the employees again and re-interview them in 1986, at the behest of Lieutenant Robert Smith of the 6th District Headquarters. As to whether any of their names remain on the persons of interest list today, I cannot say. To date, the only person on the list who has been ruled out publicly is Janette's husband, Alvin Roberson. Now we're going to spend some time on the people who were treated like persons of interest or suspects, and by that, I mean they were thoroughly investigated, multiple witnesses were interviewed about them, Background reports were done, and over a period of months and years, they were looked at and re-interviewed. They also all gave fingerprint and hair samples at some point. DNA was not readily collected back then, but they did test blood for type and secretor versus non-secretor attributes for elimination purposes in some cases. So we will begin with Alvin. Of course, they looked at Janette's husband. He was the first person they looked at. That's how it works. Police always start with the people closest to the victim and work outward, like ripples in a lake when you toss in a stone. This is what a co-worker of his, named Al, told me about Alvin. I worked with Alvin when the shop was in Reed City and met Janette a couple of times. I typically picked on her about her southern accent. After the shop moved to Marion, I worked in the same area with Al. We became closer friends. The day she was murdered, I saw it on the news at home and I called him. I remember telling him I wanted to make sure it was not his wife. And he told me that it was. So I drove into town and sat with him a while. When I left, I went downtown and told the police that they should at least send someone to tell him what was going on, because he was completely in the dark. I don't remember if it was the next day or the following day, but they came to question me at work. I remember them asking questions about him, mostly what type of guy he was. But the thing I remember most was them asking about paint that we used at work. At the time, we used a lot of red paint, and I'm sure it was on his shoes. He told me later that they took his work boots. I think they wanted to know about red paint to rule out what was on the top of his boots. I also remember him having to leave work early one day to give them a hair sample. He was concerned about it and said that there was a chance his hair might be on Janette because they slept in the same bed and used the same brush. What seems like months later, a different officer came to work and did the interview again. No questions about paint this time. They pretty much asked my relationship with him and basically asked if I thought he was capable of such a thing. I remember telling them, at the time during lunch, something had come on the radio about a random, dumb killing. Alvin started crying and said something to the effect of, "Has the whole world gone fucking crazy?" Alvin and I became closer friends after that. We worked on cars together, things like that, until they moved away to Georgia. What I was left with after Al Foot's recollection is an image of Alvin Roberson sitting in the apartment and looking at his children after finding out that his wife is dead, and he's wondering what he's supposed to be doing because he has no frame of reference for what's happening right now. It's easy to speculate. Of course the husband did it. I heard that more times than I can count while researching this case. The first time I spoke with Reed City Police Chief Chuck Davis, even he told me that the overriding feeling in law enforcement was that Alvin had done it. He told me that at one point they thought Alvin was close to confessing, but someone walked into the room and Alvin clammed up. I spoke to Detective Southworth, and he told me that he also believed Alvin was on the verge of confessing at some point, and thought Alvin was the likely perp, at least at the time. He said there were a few things that made him believe Alvin was the perpetrator, including his demeanor on the day of the murder and how he left town. Southworth did tell me, though, that he recalled Detective Pratt not being convinced that Alvin had killed his wife, and he recalled it was based in part on the types of injuries that she sustained. Lauren Thorson did recall that they got what eventually turned out to be a set of prints that matched Alvin's from a countertop at the opposite end of the room from where she was found. Multiple people said that Alvin was in the store that day, and these folks were also quick to note that that wasn't normal. Flossie told me that she didn't remember him ever coming in, and she didn't even remember him coming in on that day. But let me pose a theory here, and you are perfectly within your rights to completely disregard it. If Janette had, in fact, been getting obscene phone calls, as reported to Prosecutor Talaski, and there was someone coming into the pet department bothering her, maybe Alvin was checking in on his wife. Maybe he wanted to show up when the person came in. It may have been odd for him to stop into the store, but it was noted early in the Michigan State Police report that Alvin was laid off from his job for that week, so he wasn't working. Maybe he had nothing better to do that day. Also, Flossie had told me that Janette got a phone call early in the day, and as she recalled it, Janette had to go up to the school to pick up one or both of her children. At least that's what Janette had told them. If that's the case, maybe once she returned, she called Alvin to bring her lunch, because she would be unable to leave again, as was her routine, since she had already left the store once that day. I did confirm that she always left the store for lunch and often ate with her mother, Marion Fisher. Many people pointed to the fact that Alvin left town right after the murder as evidence of his guilt. That's something I am happy to clear up right now. He didn't leave town right after the murder. In fact, he left Michigan in September of 1983, 8 months after the murder of his wife, according to the Michigan State Police report. Now, maybe I'm naive, but if you're an innocent man, and you know you're innocent because you didn't do it, 8 months probably does feel like a sufficient amount of time to subject yourself to repeated questioning from police, town gossip, and the breathtakingly painful proximity to where your wife was brutally slain. Next, we're going to talk about Dale. Dale was a teenager who lived in the same apartment complex as Janette and visited her and the store often. In fact, according to Marion Fisher, he came by Janette's apartment with a friend on the day she was murdered. About Dale and what his relationship was with Janette, I got everything on the spectrum from he had a crush on her to one gentleman who lived near Upton at the time of the murder telling me that Dale had once told him that he'd spent the night with her. Because we're talking about a teenager, we have to remember that they often say and do things that aren't all that smart, and that will play into his story in just a moment. It seems, based on this story I heard from Chris Cassavetes, whose father had been in the store that day, that it got around the apartment complex pretty quickly. Chris told me that on January 19th, 1983, he was going to a friend's house after school around 5 or so. One of the friends had heard a blurb on the 5 o'clock news about a murder down at Gamble's, and when Chris got there, they were all revved up to find out what had happened. They wanted Chris to go down and ask Janette about it because they knew he was friends with her. So he put on his coat and headed over to Janette's. He said to me, "Thank God the little Langworthy girl intercepted me. She was running towards me from Jenny's house." Jenny is Janette's daughter. And she said, "Chris, Jenny's mom is dead." Chris wasn't questioned at the time of the murder, but he was questioned when he was living out of town with relatives a couple years later. He said some state police showed up, and their questions were mostly about Dale. Apparently, Dale had made a wanted poster over at the Career Center in computer class and hung it in his bedroom window. A wanted poster. He hung it in his window, where everyone in town could see it. Chris took this as jestful, but it seems as though Dale felt that police thought he had killed Janette and he was feeling the pressure, so he acted out like awkward teenagers tend to do in situations where they have no idea how they're supposed to be acting, nor do they fully appreciate the possible ramifications of their impulsivity. I mean, how would you act if this older girl that you had a crush on got murdered? One of his buddies probably should have, and likely did, tell him that putting a wanted poster in his bedroom window for the whole apartment complex to see was probably not the best way to go. Having heard that teens from the apartment complex seemed to gravitate toward Janette's apartment, I asked Chris if people generally hung out there, and he said yes, she was very friendly, and they just were sort of all in and out. Mark Truman told me that he thought Janette acted differently around Dale than other people. I didn't find anything in the report to suggest that Dale had been in the store that day, though. Police did interview his high school principal as well as the administrators at the Career Center, where he went off campus for part of the day. Mark Truman told me that he did remember Dale being at school that day, because he saw him. In January of 1984, Dale gave finger and palm prints for comparison purposes, and the report notes that at that time no additional information was gleaned in the interview Detective Pratt did since his last interview in February of 1983. The final notation made in 1985 was a list of 4 items in manila envelopes with the notation, "The above items were obtained on January 4th, 1984, and submitted to the Bridgeport Crime Lab on October 9th, 1985. It looks like they had the samples they needed and they were trying to rule him out. Next, we're going to talk about Lee Peterson, and this subject is a bit sensitive. On January 23rd, 1984, 1 year almost to the day after the murder of Janette Roberson, information came in from an anonymous source. Quote, "The source feared that he may have been involved in the homicide of the victim in this case. The source said that the subject had returned to the area 2 weeks before Christmas in 1982 and was staying with a relative. The relative's information was given, and the report notes that the residence in question is the same apartment complex as Janette and her family lived. Quote, the victim's rear entrance of her apartment faced the same courtyard which the front entrance of the family member's apartment faced. According to the anonymous source, the subject remained living with this relative until a day or two after Christmas, at which time he moved to an apartment complex that was less than a mile from the victim's apartments. Multiple people were questioned in January about Lee Peterson. Lee graduated from Reed City High School and had been in the Army, Vietnam, and was honorably discharged. He had family in the area. The other thing you need to know about Lee Peterson is that he was mentally ill. I spoke to a woman who worked at an adult foster care facility in the area who said that he had terrorized multiple women who worked at the foster home for months. He would come and bang on the wall or the garage door. After a while, he started showing up around where the women lived. He'd been seen walking around the immediate area of each of their homes. According to the woman I spoke to, he was stalking them, at least 3 other women in addition to her, and they all worked at the same foster care facility. These women were interviewed according to the Michigan State Police report. She described Peterson as handsome, aggressive, and he would be walking down the street near her house, talking to himself like he was having a violent conversation. When I asked her how that all ended, she told me that one night he was apprehended in Paris, Michigan. She said the place was lit up like crazy. She wasn't sure what became of Lee Peterson after that, but her understanding was that he was put in a mental hospital as the result of this apprehension. There is a notation about this in the report. Detective Pratt visited him at a hospital to question him about Janette's murder. The connection here is that Lee's mother once owned the gamble store, and it's possible that they even found his prints in the basement. When I tried to nail Detective Pratt down about this, he would only say that you cannot date fingerprints, so just because you found someone's print at the scene does not mean they were the perpetrator. And also, on the other side of that coin, not finding someone's prints there does not necessarily exclude them. The ex-wife of Lee Peterson verified that he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic at the Kalamazoo Hospital while they were married. She remembered police coming to ask her questions about Lee in the 1980s, but had no idea what it was in reference to. She assumed it was due to him being in and out of mental institutions since as early as 1977. She said police were only there for a short time and never gave her any information other than asking him about his personality. She said this, "He beat my daughter black and blue from her neck down and was charged with child abuse and never saw her again." She said he would never stay on his medications and that he was absolutely capable of violence. According to her, he was very sick. The whole conversation made me sad for everyone involved, and it quickly became apparent why police went at Lee Peterson so hard. He definitely looks good on paper for the murder. He's got a history of violence. He's familiar with the physical location where the murder occurred. He was in Reed City during the appropriate time frame. But the question is, could they link him to the crime scene on the day of the murder? Whether or not he was capable of violence, I had seen no evidence that put Lee Peterson at the scene of Janette's murder that day at all. On October 8, 1984, Detective Pratt traveled with Eldon Whitford, a local social worker, to Traverse City State Hospital. They met with a caseworker and psychiatrist to discuss Lee's ability to be questioned about the murder. Detective Pratt was told that Lee could differentiate between right and wrong and would be aware of what happened in January 1983. They were told that talking with him would not or should not upset him, and if he had committed the murder and wanted to talk, he could. Lee was interviewed, and the remarks at the end of the supplemental describing the event reads, Quote, "Nothing learned up to this point in this investigation can eliminate or verify him as the suspect." Another reason that they would be taking a hard look at Lee is because of the assault itself. The overkill aspect, the manic use of multiple weapons, all of that could point to someone who is mentally ill. Specific to schizophrenia, when the patient is prone to going off his medications, the basic elements of what a crime scene is or isn't, based on generalities, can get thrown out the window. Things like motive can be harder to figure out when the motive is nothing more than the illness of a person in the throes of a dissociative or psychotic episode. That makes it a bit harder to read a crime scene. I want to pause here in telling Lee's story with regard to the Roberson murder and say something important. There's pain, and then there's an abyss from which some people never return. Most of us cannot fathom that kind of confusion and despair. And in cases like this, it is best to do what good humans do and try to empathize rather than judge. I should note that I have people with mental illness in my family. I have a cousin who was schizophrenic and killed himself. It is from this perspective that I can look at someone and understand that the person and the illness are two different things, while physically they will always be bound together. When you're talking about someone who is mentally ill, you're talking about someone who is dealing with something profound that they did not ask for, nor do they want. None of what I just said, however, means that people with mental illness cannot commit horrible crimes. They can, and do, and should be held to account like anyone else as the law allows. I do think it's important to note that people with mental illness are at a far greater risk of being the victim of a crime than the perpetrator. So with that said, here's where Lee's story goes from there, from that hospital where he stayed for some unknown time, until August 25, 1996, 13 years after the death of Janette Roberson. A man named Bernard Rouse walked into the Cadillac Police Department and said that he had found a man lying dead with a knife beside him. An officer was sent to the scene and found the body of Lee Peterson in his apartment. The door was unlocked. The report included a list of evidence taken from the scene, descriptions of what was to be photographed, brief descriptions of how the officers handled the scene, and 2 other incident reports involving Lee Peterson, one in March and one in May of the same year, 1996, prior to his death. The report in March was a citation for a noisy muffler and excessive fumes. The incident on May 16, 1996 was a suspicious situation and a well-being check. Officers were dispatched to check on a subject that may have fallen and injured himself. Quote, "Initial contact with Lee Peterson required the fire department and EMS to assist, as he had an apparent injury, dried blood near his ear, and his mattress was smoldering. Lee was in need of mental health, yet he refused treatment. He was disoriented, overactive, talking in confused sentences, and wanting to preach the Christian way. Neighbors stated that he had mental problems in the past, but this was far more serious behavior." The first responders to Lee Peterson's apartment had wisely called in an evidence team from Grand Rapids to handle the scene in the interest of thoroughness. They knew what the scene looked like, but they needed to make sure there wasn't anything suspicious involved. So they took every possible precaution to make sure it was a suicide, given that on paper, 80-something stab wounds doesn't sound like suicide. Yes, I said 80-something stab wounds. They are almost all superficial. I would call them scratches or nicks. Cops would probably call them hesitation wounds. The officers took great care in documenting the entire scene, and it seems clear that whatever occurred during Lee Peterson's last day, it took a little while. He was wandering around that apartment, clearly not in his right mind, based on the scrawled suicide note found in the kitchen drawer, which contains not even one complete, meaningful sentence. Lee Peterson was a very sick man who had served our country, and my first instinct is to wonder whether our mental health system failed him. I'd like to think that if he were alive today, he'd get better care, but I don't know if that's the case. You can't force someone who's living on their own to take their prescribed medication, and it's very common for people diagnosed with schizophrenia to stop taking their medications for various reasons, including not liking how it makes them feel. The report indicated that Lee was being supervised and had a home visit by a mental health worker just days before his death. The man had helped him get his pills together in a pillbox, yet it appears, based on what was in the container after he died, he hadn't been taking the appropriate dosage. In addition, the mental health worker noted that he had seen 20 or 30 tablets in the haloperidol bottle when he'd visited 2 days prior, but only the empty haloperidol bottle was found when the officers arrived. In the end, I was not able to locate even one person that could put Lee Peterson at the gamble store on the day Janette Roberson was murdered. Maybe that information is in her witness report somewhere. Clearly, a lot was held back. But I think it's more likely that Michigan State Police looked at Lee Peterson because he had a history of erratic behavior and violence. He was in town when the murder occurred, and at that point, it was the best lead that they had. Police only started looking at him after an anonymous caller suggested they should, a full year after the murder. Chris Mills seems to me like an even more desperate lead, a young man who basically got swept up in a murder investigation because he had a vengeful ex-girlfriend, scratches on his face and hands, and had driven through Reed City the day Janette was murdered. In 1983, Chris Mills worked for Curtis Wire Products in Petoskey. He was a truck driver who hauled things like refrigerator wire and oven racks from Grand Rapids to Petoskey, which means he passed through Reed City by way of Old Highway 131. It was a regular route for him and his partner, who took turns driving the loads. When he drove that route, Chris would stop at a restaurant called Minier's for lunch. He said he had been stopping there for years, and based on his recollection of the events of January 19th, 1983, he was there at approximately 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Earlier that day, Chris says he stopped at a business called Little Engines, which was on the south side of Reed City. They sold lawnmowers, chainsaws, and things like that. He had to park his rig across the street along the side of Old 131 because of its size. He was hauling a 47-foot trailer, and with the rig, he believes it was about 60 foot long. You can't just slide a vehicle that size into a spot and call it a day. There's a bit of planning involved. Chris mentioned that the name of the business, Curtis Wire, was on the truck in red and white, clearly visible. He assumed that's how they tracked him down, as having been in town that day. Someone saw the truck, knew he'd passed through, and that's why police wanted to speak to him. Well, that's not exactly the case, based on the report. Cynthia Trowbridge, his ex-girlfriend, called in a tip. When I spoke to him, he didn't even appear to have put that together. "Man, that was a bad time in my life," he said. "I lived in Bel Air back then, and I had an ex who was stalking me. She was breaking into my house, and the police couldn't catch her. I even took out a restraining order, but that didn't help." "Is this by any chance Ms. Trowbridge?" I asked him. "Yeah, how do you know that?" he said. I told him that her name was in the report and that I was aware of her criminal history. So Chris said it started like this. One day he woke up and found a note on his door that said 2 detectives were looking to speak to him. He had no idea what it was about, and at that time had not even heard of the murder in Reed City. Chris couldn't remember if the detectives called him or if he contacted them after seeing the note, but they came to his home and asked him to come to the sheriff's department so they could talk to him. He was confused and he didn't know what it was all about, but he went with them anyway. When they got to the sheriff's department, they told him his truck had been seen in Reed City around the time of the murder. They questioned him regarding his whereabouts on the day of the murder and then asked for a hair sample. Chris said that he believes they also took fingerprints. So after they questioned Chris, he said they took him home. Not long after that, the detectives showed up at a restaurant where he was with friends. They said they needed to talk to him again. Chris told me that it was embarrassing and he felt that they were being intimidating. He said they started following him around after that, and it got so bad that he had to get a lawyer. I didn't know anything about a murder. I didn't even know where the store was, and they kept talking about a basement. I asked them what kind of idiot would kill someone and then drive away in a truck that had their work name all over it. And where did they think I was supposed to park that truck in Reed City? Did they think I drove it up to the store, double-parked, and then went in and killed somebody and nobody noticed? Chris mentioned that he had a scratch on his face, which they asked about. He told me that it was from a scuffle he had gotten into with Trowbridge. She had scratched his face. And he also said that his parents had some cats, so he had some scratches on his hands, too. He said that he later found out Trowbridge told police that she had seen him washing blood out of a jacket. "Yeah, I was, my hunting jacket," he said to me. Chris was not aware of what the interaction between police and his employer was, but he was glad that they were a good company. He said, "Anyone else would have fired me, between the cops asking questions and my stalker ex constantly calling me." Theodore Platts was the officer with the Reed City Police Department who had assaulted 2 Michigan State Police troopers and a customer at the Buckboard Bar, next door to Gamble's, in December of 1982, a few weeks before the murder. He is also the only law enforcement officer that was fingerprinted, according to the report, and that's likely because he was in the store twice on the day of the murder. Because his entire witness statement was redacted, along with all of the witness statements in the report, I don't know what times he was at the store as a patron. All I know is that he was there twice, according to Detective Pratt. Early on in his report, he noted, quote, "Northern County's Evidence Service had been requested to do the scene prior to the undersigned's arrival, with Director Lauren Thorson coming to the scene being assisted by evidence technicians Sergeant Marvin Dornbos of the Cadillac Police Department, Sergeant David Bailey of the Wexford County Sheriff's Department, Patrol Officer Theodore Platts of the Reed City Police Department, and Detective Sergeant James Southworth of the Osceola County Sheriff's Department, along with the undersigned, in processing the scene." It is unclear when Officer Platts arrived or who called him, although former Osceola County Prosecutor James Telasky told me that Platts was present when he arrived at the scene. When I interviewed Detective Pratt for the book, I asked him who called Platts to the scene, and he said he didn't know. I also asked him if he knew Platts was suspended at the time, and he said he was not aware that he was. Prosecutor Telasky confirmed to me that he was, and went further to say that there was a warrant for his arrest on Telasky's desk on the day of Janette's murder. This was for the bar assault. According to the incident report regarding the assault at the Buckboard Bar, Michigan State Troopers Lyle and Norman were at the Reed City Post when they received a call from the barmaid. Trooper Lyle took the call, and she asked who was on duty for Reed City PD. Here is an excerpt from the report. Sergeant Horchner attempted to raise a Reed City PD car, but obtained no reply. Suddenly, the complainant was heard to yell over the phone, "Hey, hey!" Trooper Lyle then indicated that he was still on the phone, and the complainant asked that a patrol unit be sent, as Ted Platts was in the bar, drunk, and beating on one of the patrons, and she wanted him to leave. Troopers Lyle and Norman responded, and Sergeant Horchner stated that he would get a hold of Reed City PD police chief and ascertain if anyone from Reed City PD was working, and advise them of the incident. While en route, radio traffic from the post advised that no one was working for Reed City PD and that the Reed City police chief was not going to respond. He advised that he wanted our department to handle the incident. Troopers tried to contact Police Chief Rathbun multiple times, and they were eventually told by him that he was not coming to the scene, and he instructed them to, quote, "do what they must do." Chief Rathbun had held a holiday party earlier that night, and Officer Platts had attended, according to an interview he did with the Osceola Herald newspaper in March, following his firing. There were multiple witnesses to the incident at the Buckboard. According to the barmaid, Officer Platts came into the bar around 12:30 a.m. and she served him one drink, and it was obvious that he was already inebriated. He sat down next to a couple that he knew, a husband and wife, and began a conversation. At some point, Platts referred to the female as a broad, to which the husband took umbrage. He told Platts not to make comments about his wife. A brief argument ensued, which then settled back into a conversation shortly thereafter. Moments later, according to the witness report of the barmaid, she heard the husband say, "One of these times you are going to be without your uniform." Platts unzipped his jacket and said, "I don't have it on now." The barmaid's statement continued, quote, "The husband then asked Platts if he wanted to go out back and discuss the matter, and the two men got up and left the bar and walked into the restroom together. It was at this time that the barmaid phoned the state police requesting officers. The barmaid states after hanging up the phone, she heard loud voices and a loud thumping noise coming from the men's restroom. At this point, a young man, also seated at the bar, got up and said to the barmaid, 'I'm sorry all this is happening. I'll be right back.' The young man who was assaulted, listed as a 28-year-old bar patron, also gave a statement. We in the bar could still hear them arguing, so I went into the bathroom to quiet them down. The young man went into the restroom, and the barmaid heard loud voices again, and it sounded like the walls were going to come down. The barmaid went to the men's restroom door and opened it and found Platts holding the young man against the wall by his neck and yelling, 'I don't need any motherfucking kid telling me what to do.' Ted yelled at him and hit him in the face and hit him in the face again. Ted turned him around and hit him again. Then Platts drove the young man to the floor hard. At that time, I went back to the bar, and the state police officers came through the front door. Platts, coming from the restroom towards the bar, saw the state police officers and stated, 'What is the state police doing in my city?' Officers arrived at the Buckboard Bar and upon entering found victim 1, Robert Smith, sitting with his back towards the door, on the south end of the bar. Trooper Norman approached the complainant and was inquiring as to what occurred. The suspect yelled at the officers, 'Norman and Lyle, what the hell is the state police doing in my city?' Trooper Lyle responded by telling him they had been asked to come to the bar as there was no one working for Reed City PD. The suspect then yelled, 'Oh hell, I'm tired of you two working in my city. You want to know what happened? I'll tell you what happened. I hit that son of a bitch. I hit him right in the head. No young punk is going to tell me what to do.' Trooper Lyle then inquired of Mr. Smith if he had been hit, and he replied yes. Trooper Norman then requested the complainant to inform the suspect to leave, and she turned to the suspect and advised him that she wanted him to leave. The suspect made no movements to leave and continued to yell obscenities at Mr. Smith and both officers. The suspect yelled, 'I'm not leaving because the state police say I have to leave, and I hit that son of a bitch,' pointing again to Mr. Smith. 'Arrest me. Go ahead. Arrest me.' Trooper Lyle advised the suspect that the complainant wanted him to leave, and he replied, 'I'm not going to leave, and the state police can't make me. I'll only leave if she says I have to,' and pointed to the complainant. At this time, Trooper Lyle asked the complainant to again tell Mr. Platts he had to leave. The complainant looked at the suspect, and then the suspect asked, 'Do you want me to leave?' And the complainant replied, 'Yes, Ted, I think it's for the best.' 'Okay, I'm leaving, but only because she wants me to and not because you two say I have to. Fuck the state police.' The suspect then started to move toward the south doorway past the officers. But the suspect then stopped, turned around, and walked back up to the officers and yelled, 'You two can't go around pushing people around. And you, Norman, I don't care if you were shot before. It doesn't give you the right to push people either.' Trooper Norman then informed the suspect again that he would have to leave, and if he didn't, they would have to escort him out. The suspect became visibly upset. Upon hearing Trooper Norman's statement that if he didn't leave, the officers would have to escort him out of the bar, the suspect yelled, 'You two think you can make me leave?' and then repeated the same statement. Officers made no reply, and the suspect raised both of his hands and pointed a finger of each hand toward the officers and yelled, 'You two can't make me leave,' and gestured with the pointing finger of each hand toward the officers. Suddenly, the suspect reached and moved toward the officers and grabbed the front of each officer's jacket and drove with his body and hands the officers back. The suspect continued to push forcefully the officers backwards. The action caused the tables to be overturned, as well as the chairs, and caused empty bottles on the tables to be broken. Trooper Lyle was able to free himself from the grasp of the suspect and gained a submissive hold on the suspect's right arm and applied leverage. This action, coupled with the driving motion of the suspect, caused the officers to slam to the floor along with the suspect. The suspect sustained a contusion to the forehead caused when both of the officers and the suspect slammed to the floor. Also, the suspect had a small amount of blood just below his nose, which also occurred upon impact of the floor. These were the extent of the injuries sustained by the suspect while in the custody of Troopers Norman and Lyle. After the suspect had been subdued and was being led by Trooper Lyle out of the bar, the suspect yelled, "Norman, you're dead. I'm going to kill you, you motherfucking son of a bitch." Just as the suspect and Trooper Lyle started through the door going out, the suspect stated, 16 years I've been a police officer, and I only have one more year before retirement, and now that's gone." Just prior to officers' attempts to persuade the suspect to leave the buckboard bar, Trooper Lyle used his portable radio to contact the post for the Reed City PD chief to come to the scene, as the suspect was very intoxicated and it was felt that the suspect would not be cooperative with officers, and it was their intention to avoid violence with the off-duty Reed City police officer. After the assault by the suspect on the officers and the subsequent arrest of the suspect, Trooper Lyle again contacted the post via portable radio and advised the post of the assault and arrest of the suspect. Trooper Lyle again asked if Reed City Police Chief was en route to the scene. The post advised that the chief was not coming to the scene and for the officers to do what they must do, in the words of the chief. At the suggestion of the Reed City Police Chief, Philip Rathbun, they called for an Osceola County Sheriff's Department unit for backup. As Trooper Lyle and the suspect were exiting the bar, Officer Davis of the Osceola County Sheriff's Department arrived. The suspect was placed into a county patrol unit with a prisoner cage due to the suspect's still violent condition. The suspect was then transported to the Osceola County Jail. At the Osceola County Jail, the suspect continued to say that he was going to kill that son of a bitch and that he will never see the daylight again. These statements were repeated over and over by the suspect. According to the Osceola County Jail intake form, the suspect was violent and hit his right hand against the booking window many times, and it also notes that as a result, he was treated at the hospital. On December 29th, less than a month before Janette Roberson's murder, the Pioneer ran a short couple paragraphs on the assault. Reed City officer pleads innocent to assault. A Reed City police officer has pleaded innocent to charges of assaulting a man and 2 state police troopers while off duty at the Buckboard Bar on Upton Avenue, December 21st. Theodore Platts, 42, of Reed City, was released on personal recognizance and $1,000 bond on the 2 charges. He demanded examination and waived the 12-day rule in 77th District Court. Platts is charged with assaulting Robert A. Smith at the Reed City Bar. Troopers Gary L. Lyle and Harry E. Norman, Jr. investigated that complaint. Platts allegedly assaulted the officers when they arrived on scene. Reed City Police Chief Philip Rathbun said his department did not reply to the call as there was not an officer on duty at the time. It was a routine off time for the city department. Platts is on sick leave at this time. He called in, saying he had a broken hand. Effective February 18, 1983, Theodore Platts was notified of his termination of the employment with this city. According to the Pioneer newspaper, it wasn't until September 12, 1983, 8 months later, that Theodore Platts pled guilty to attempted resisting, obstructing or assaulting a police officer in Osceola County Circuit Court before Judge Lawrence C. Root. Platts was sentenced in November in Osceola County Circuit Court, ordered to pay a fine of $100, costs of $300, to serve 30 days in the Osceola County Jail under a work release program, and placed on probation for 2 years. Apparently, Osceola County is extremely forgiving. Mr. Platts would go on to become the head of the probation department for Osceola County. According to the Buckboard Assault Police Report, among the journal entries in that case, it is noted that Detective Pratt took fingerprints and pictures of Ted Platts. Detective Pratt was not working on the Buckboard bar assault case, so it is of note that that was recorded as having been done, and that was about a month after Janette's murder. Given that they took his fingerprints along with the employees and others that had been downstairs on the day that Janette was murdered, that would seem to indicate that Officer Platts had gone downstairs to the pet department as a shopper that day, as a customer, on at least one of his 2 visits to the Gamble store. Also of note, when I spoke with Prosecutor Talaski, who was called to the scene that day, he told me that when he encountered Platts in the basement with the rest of the officers, his arm was still wrapped in a sling or a cast from punching the booking window at the jail weeks earlier, the night of his arrest. In his case, what would be of value to know is if the clothing that he was seen wearing after the murder was the same clothing that he had worn earlier that day on his 2 visits to the store prior to the murder. I have no doubt that there have been other suspects over the years, and suspects that I missed in the highly redacted file that I received from the Michigan State Police. Based on the fingerprint list, it looks like they looked at all the employees, and multiple people were fingerprinted and their hair samples were taken, although I do not have a list of everyone who complied with that request to give those samples. It's possible that some were asked and did not comply. There is one other person that I believe they looked into, and his name is Danny. That's based on a statement that he gave that I obtained. Danny said that he had met Janette in the pet store 2 or 3 weeks prior to her murder. He was looking for fish for his aquarium. He and Janette chatted for a little bit, and it seemed like they both had an interest in cars. Janette worked at an auto parts store prior to moving to Reed City. According to Danny, he said that she told him she missed working at that job because she liked it. Danny himself worked for an auto shop in Cadillac, Michigan, and he offered to give Janette a ride so that she could put in an application, which she did, and then on the way back they stopped to look at an old car that was for sale, a '55 Chevy. Danny said that Janette told him that if he would purchase it, she would make payments on it to him and work on it at his garage. Danny says that the next day he asked his boss if he was going to hire Janette, but he said that while she was pleasant and capable of doing the job, which was a sales position, he couldn't hire her if the expectation was that she would be riding to work with him. Something about her divorce not being final. This is what Danny said anyway. Then he says that a couple days later he picked Janette up in Reed City, only to learn when he arrived that her son and her husband Alvin were coming with them. He described the mood as tense on the ride over to look at that '55 Chevy that he and Janette had previously seen. Danny said that when they got there, he asked Alvin to help him jack up the Chevy and change 2 tires. According to him, they got a little ways down the road, towing that vehicle, when one of the wheels came off. Danny said that he asked Alvin to go after the wheel while he jacked up the vehicle again. He said Janette was totally different in this instance than when they previously had spent time together, and he described the situation as dark. Like all of the other persons of interest, Danny was also in the store the day that Janette was murdered.